Hello and welcome to NewsClick. We have with us the Cuban ambassador to India, Ambassador Ramirez, to discuss Cuba U.S. relationship. After 50 years, Cuba has been under siege. The Cuban Revolution has sparked off a huge attack by U.S. in different forms. There are extra-legal restrictions on Cuban companies. There are various other embargoes on Cuba. The terrorist attacks which are being mounted from within the United States. Do you think under the Obama administration there is going to be any change, or is it going to be policy as usual?
Well, I think already 1 year has passed since Obama took power, and I think there is time enough already to realize that nothing has changed. Only a little more clever policy with some ingredients of what they call smart policy that sometimes are even more dangerous, in the sense that this smart policy gives a lot of a leverage to subversive activities. So already Cuban President Raúl Castro has reiterated that we were willing to, and we are still willing to have a better relationship with the United States, provided only that we are considered as an equal and sovereign nation and be treated as on equal par. But this is what's not happening. Blockade is the same. We don't like to use the word embargo. Embargo gives the indication of something bilateral, which is not the case. It is an economic and financial blockade. It's stronger than ever. Fines are put on companies doing business with Cuba. Restrictions are the same. The only small thing that he has done is to eliminate some travel restrictions to Cuban Americans to travel to visit their relatives. These are inhuman restrictions that former President Bush introduced. But the whole architecture of the blockade is totally intact, and in fact in some areas is reinforced.
So there is really no significant change or any change that you can see in the Cuban-American relations currently. The policies remain virtually the same.
It remains, for us, the most important indication of any change is the blockade.
And that
is the blockade is intact, the rest is just rhetoric and public relation exercise.
But under the earlier administration, there was also a lot of terrorist attacks being mounted from within the United States. Do you think the internal policies of the U.S. government has made any difference to these attacks, or they continue in the same way?
I cannot say whether they have been having plans for terrorist attacks during Obama's administration, but yes, they do have carried out subversive actions. And in fact, there is one American citizen in jail in Cuba because he came last year introducing satellite communication devices to give to the mercenaries that they have in Cuba in order to communicate with their masters in the United States. So again, using this new technique that the CIA is using, what they call contractors, the same as they used in Iraq with Blackwater Water Company. Now they are using another contractor to bring these devices to provide communication alternatives without any restriction or any license whatsoever with these people. So subversive activities are indeed there, and they are growing. And, but the most important thing is that there is no real condemnation or any action whatsoever to those terrorists who have attacked Cuba. And you see that Posada Carriles, which is a heinous murderer, is sometimes called the Obama bin Laden of Latin America. He's free on the streets of Miami, and even doing campaign and talking on radio shows.
That's an interesting point, that the United States publicly takes a position that any country which harbors a terrorist, they have the right to go in and take preemptive action, take people out, and so on. This is basically the argument they have been using all over. How then do they square this with the fact that Posada Carriles, who is responsible for 71 people being killed in that plane which was blown up, the Cuban Airlines, how do they then square this with the fact that they're providing shelter, that he's gone public on this, he's claimed publicly that he's responsible for terrorist attacks? How does U.S.
Indeed,
defend
this is a clear indication of the double standards of the U.S. foreign policy. It's not just Bush or Obama. All of them are having this double standards on foreign policy. In fact, these days we are denouncing, condemning the fact that they have included Cuba in the list of terrorist states, which is indeed adding insult to injury. It's really an offense for us to be included there. We have been the victim to more terrorist attacks. In Cuba, more people have died of terrorist attacks coming from the United States than all who died in 9/11. So it's a clear indication, and there has not been a single case of any action, terrorist action from Cuba to the United States. And the case of the Cuban 5 is also a connection and indication of this double standard in the American policy against terrorism.
What I understand is in 1998 that Cuba gave a lot of information to the United States showing how these attacks were being planned from the United States. The result was the FBI, instead of taking action against the people concerned, took action against the people who had provided the information, and that's really the origin of the Cuban 5. Is that correct?
Exactly, that is exactly the case, and that's another issue why we are so strongly defending this Cuban 5, and we are so angry with the U.S. government because there was no attitude, a gentleman attitude on an information that we provided to them. We informed them that the U.S. government, U.S. citizens will be attacked by these terrorists, not only Cubans, but U.S., because we informed them there were plots of again bombing civilian airplanes. And instead of putting in jail these terrorist organizations who are still free in Miami, they put in jail. They got to know who were leaking the information whatsoever and put in jail the Cuban 5. Yes, they were Cuban civilians who were under the Cuban government, but they never got any security information from any installation from the United States. Their only objective was trying to monitor and to avoid terrorist attacks coming from Miami against Cuba. And the funny story is because this is one of the most incredible trials in the history of the United States, is that in one of the trials, the judge said whenever this fellow comes out of the jail, he will not be allowed to visit the places where Cuban radicals are plotting anything against Cuba. So even the judge realizes and recognizes that there are organizations plotting to subvert by violent means the Cuban government, and they protect them and put in jail the Cuban 5s.
The world opinion, including votes in the United General Assembly, has always been that this blockade is illegal and the US should lift its blockade. Do you think that's made any difference to the US policies, but the US thinks that the world opinion doesn't really matter?
I think it has affected the credibility of the US foreign policy, because the United States has been totally isolated on the issue of the condemnation of the US blockade on Cuba. Last year, it took 192 nations supporting Cuba. Only the United States, Israel, which is of course, is more of the same, and it has such a strong connection with the Americans, and one tiny island in the Pacific.
Marshall Islands. Mm-hmm. Marshall Islands are the third country.
Which is just a neo-colony of the Americans. So, except that, all the nations around the world supported Cuba. So it's probably one of the strongest resolution with the more unanimity, and it sends a message that the whole international community is against that policy. And also it indicates that we have to provide more relevance to the General Assembly instead than to the Security Council. Because that is what is happening, because they control the Security Council. The Security Council is the only body that can have executive powers. So they avoid any action that may eliminate this blockade on Cuba.
Thank you, Ambassador. This was really good. Hope that we can discuss more in the future.